Dear gentle folk of Newport, or maybe I should say hats and cats.
Hollywood's golden age gave us some of the most beloved names in the history of entertainment. Men whose faces filled cinema screens, whose voices sold records, and whose public images were carefully constructed and fiercely protected by the studios that owned them. Behind many of those images was a very different story. 10 of the era's most celebrated actors terrorized the people who lived with them, and for decades, almost none of it reached the public. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on those hidden lives. Number 10, Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was the most famous human being on Earth for a stretch of the 1920s. The Little Tramp, the bowler hat, the cane, the shuffle, was recognized in every country that had a cinema. The man behind the costume bore almost no resemblance to his screen creation. Chaplin was born in London in 1889 and arrived in America in 1913, becoming a global icon within a decade. He was also a man who systematically pursued and married teenage girls across his entire adult life. His first wife, Mildred Harris, was 16 years old when he began pursuing her in 1918. He was 29. He married her after believing she was pregnant. The marriage lasted 2 years. She later accused him of mental cruelty. His second wife, Leda Gray, was 15 when Chaplin first became interested in her. He had met her when she was 12 years old, and he was casting for the kid. She became pregnant at 16. Under California law, Chaplin could have been charged with statutory rape. He was 35 at the time. To avoid prosecution, he took her to Mexico and married her in a secret ceremony in November 1924. Their 1927 divorce became the most sensational public scandal Hollywood had seen up to that point. In a 50-page court filing, Gray accused Chaplin of demanding she have an abortion, of pulling a gun on her, and of a long list of what the documents called perverted, degenerate, and indecent acts. The settlement, then one of the largest in California history, cost him approximately $1 million. His reputation took a significant blow, though his career survived because the public still largely separated the art from the man. His third wife, actress Paulette Goddard, and his fourth wife, Una O'Neill, were 24 and 18 respectively when they married him. He was 47 and 54. Una's father, playwright Eugene O'Neill, disowned her over the marriage and never spoke to her again. Chaplin spent his later years in Switzerland, having been denied re-entry to the United States in 1952 amid political pressure over his alleged communist sympathies. He received an honorary Academy Award in 1972 and was knighted in 1975. He died in 1977 at his home in Corsier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland. His treatment of the women and girls in his personal life remained largely unexamined during his lifetime. The full scope of what his wives had endured only became clearer in the decades following his death, as court documents were unsealed and memoirs were published. Number 9, Errol Flynn. He played knights and pirates and swashbuckling heroes on screen, and the persona was so convincing that it took years for the public to understand the distance between the character and the man. Errol Flynn was born in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia in 1909 and spent his early adulthood drifting through New Guinea and Europe before landing in Hollywood in the mid-1930s. Within 2 years of arriving, after Captain Blood, 1935 made him a star. He was one of the most recognizable faces in the world. His marriage to his first wife, French actress Lily Demita, was, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, genuinely mutual in its violence. The two were known around Hollywood as the Battling Flynns. At their one-year wedding anniversary party, according to biographers and the podcast You Must Remember This, Flynn arrived late and his wife smashed a champagne bottle over his head. He hit her in the face, breaking her tooth. Both ended up in the hospital. Warner Brothers covered it up, telling the press the injuries came from Flynn swerving his car to avoid hitting a cat. a story the studio's publicists delivered with a straight face. In 1942, Flynn was charged with statutory rape involving two underage girls, Peggy Satterlee, who was 15 at the time of the alleged assault, and Betty Hansen, who was 17. The trial lasted a month and captivated the nation. He was acquitted on all counts. The acquittal made him more famous, not less, and generated the phrase, "in like Flynn," a testament to how thoroughly his image had absorbed and reframed his behavior. He spent the remainder of his career in declining health, drinking heavily, addicted to heroin and alcohol. His contract with Warner Brothers eventually terminated. He died in Vancouver in 1959 at the age of 50. His liver was that of a man of 75. Near the end of his life, his companion was Beverly Adland, a girl he had been pursuing since she was 15 years old. Number 8, Bing Crosby. For much of the 20th century, Bing Crosby was the gold standard of the wholesome American entertainer. White Christmas, the Going My Way films, his radio show. He was Hollywood's most typical father, literally named so in a 1937 poll. His home life was something else entirely. Crosby was born in Tacoma, Washington in 1903. He married his first wife, actress Dixie Lee, in 1930. Dixie Lee herself was an alcoholic who struggled with health problems throughout their marriage. She died of ovarian cancer in 1952 at only 40 years old. They had 4 sons, Gary, Dennis, Philip, and Lindsay. By most accounts, Crosby was a cold, controlling, and at times physically brutal father who believed in strict discipline enforced through corporal punishment. He was also largely absent. Work, golf, and his own social life took priority, and when he was present, the atmosphere in the house was one of fear and unpredictability. In 1983, 6 years after Crosby's death, his eldest son Gary published a memoir called Going My Own Way, detailing a childhood of regular physical punishment. Gary described his father beating him almost daily with a belt studded with metal tips. He described being weighed each week as a child. Bing was obsessed with Gary's weight and being taken to his father's office for a beating if the number was too high. 2 of Gary's brothers, Dennis and Lindsay, later confirmed that the physical discipline was real, though they differed on its severity. Both Dennis and Lindsay later died by suicide, Dennis in 1991 and Lindsay in 1989. Bing's public relations machinery operated for decades to protect the family image, and for the most part, it worked. His daughter Mary, from his second marriage to actress Katharine Grant, later said that the documentary American Masters, Bing Crosby Rediscovered, helped bring some of the complexity of her father's legacy to light. He died in 1977 on a golf course in Spain, having just shot a round of 85, and reportedly saying it was one of the best days of his life. Gary's book arrived 6 years later and dismantled the carefully constructed legend of the warm, pipe-smoking patriarch. Of Crosby's 4 sons by Dixie Lee, 2, Dennis and Lindsay, died by suicide. Lindsay took his own life in 1989 after learning that the family inheritance was gone. Dennis died in 1991. Number 7, John Barrymore. He was called the Great Profile, and in the 1920s, that was not an exaggeration. John Barrymore, born John Sidney Blythe in 1882 in Philadelphia, into the most famous acting family in America, was widely regarded as the finest stage and screen actor of his generation. His Hamlet on Broadway in 1922 ran for 101 performances and was celebrated as a landmark of American theater. He reprised it in London the following year to equal acclaim. He made the transition to sound film with ease and starred in classics like Grand Hotel, 1932, and 20th Century, 1934. He was also a severe alcoholic whose drinking progressed, across decades, to a state of near-constant intoxication, and who was repeatedly violent with the women in his life. He married 4 times. His second wife, poet and playwright Blanche Ulrichs, who published under the name Michael Strange, described their relationship as one of psychological and emotional warfare. His third wife, actress Dolores Costello, whom he married in 1928 and who bore him 2 children, including actor John Drew Barrymore, reportedly endured years of his erratic behavior and alcoholic rages before filing for divorce in 1935. His fourth wife, actress Elaine Barry, described their time together in a memoir called All My Sins Remembered, chronicling the chaos and violence that defined their brief marriage. By the late 1930s, Barrymore was in serious physical and mental decline. His memory had deteriorated to the point where he had to read his lines from cue cards hidden around the set. He appeared in films largely as a parody of himself and spent his final years publicly humiliated and professionally diminished. He died in 1942 at the age of 60, his liver destroyed by decades of drinking. His son, John Drew Barrymore, Drew Barrymore's father, repeated the pattern, spending decades as a violent alcoholic who was jailed multiple times for drunkenness and spousal abuse, and who was long estranged from his own daughter. Number 6. Sean Connery. Sean Connery became an international superstar, playing the most famous secret agent in cinema history and the persona of James Bond, charming, sophisticated, casually dominant over women, overlapped uncomfortably with what his first wife would later say about life with him in private. Connery was born in Edinburgh in 1930, the son of a factory worker and a cleaner. He grew up in a tenement building in the Fountain Bridge district and left school at 13 to help support his family. He worked a series of manual jobs: laborer, coffin polisher, milkman, before military service in the Royal Navy, and then stumbling into modeling and acting. He had no formal training. He was cast as Bond in 1962 and was famous almost overnight, going from relative obscurity to global stardom within a year. His first wife was Australian actress Diane Salento, whom he married in 1962. They had one son, actor Jason Connery. In her 2006 autobiography, My 9 Lives, Salento described Connery as physically and emotionally abusive throughout their 11-year marriage. She wrote that he was jealous of her professional success. She had received an Academy Award nomination for Tom Jones in 1963 while married to him, and wanted her to set aside her career and function primarily as a housewife. He controlled their finances, refused to hire domestic help, and turned down acting work on her behalf without consulting her. And periodically, according to her account, he was physically violent. She described the first incident in a hotel room in Almeria, Spain, while Connery was filming The Hill in 1965. She came back to the room, he was waiting, and he hit her repeatedly until she was able to lock herself in the bathroom, where she spent the night on the floor. Connery's own public statements did little to help his case. In a 1965 Playboy interview, he stated, "I don't think there is anything particularly wrong about hitting a woman, although I don't recommend doing it in the same way that you'd hit a man. An open-handed slap is justified if all other alternatives fail, and there has been plenty of warning." In a 1987 interview with Barbara Walters, more than 20 years later, she reminded him of those remarks. He did not recant. In 1993, Vanity Fair quoted him saying that some confrontational women want a smack. When Salento's book was published and the abuse allegations resurfaced publicly, Connery canceled a planned appearance at the Scottish Parliament. A statement issued through friends said he believed no abuse of women was ever justified. He never said it publicly himself in his own name. He died in 2020 at the age of 90 in the Bahamas, and most obituaries mentioned his views on hitting women only briefly, if at all. Number 5. John Wayne. The image of John Wayne, the laconic cowboy, the unshakable war hero, the masculine ideal of an entire American generation, was one of the most durable constructions in the history of Hollywood. The private man, by the accounts of court testimony and multiple biographies, was frequently violent with the women in his life. Wayne was born Marion Robert Morrison in 1907 in Iowa. He became a star through John Ford's westerns in the late 1930s and never really stopped being one. He was married 3 times. His second wife, Mexican actress Esperanza Bauer, known as Chata, accused him in divorce proceedings in the early 1950s of repeated physical violence. She testified in court that he had blackened her eye, pulled her from bed and beaten her, called her obscene names, and manhandled her in front of guests. Wayne denied everything and accused her of alcoholism and infidelity. The settlement was substantial, and the matter was largely forgotten once it was resolved. His on-screen persona, the very image of the American hero, acted as a kind of inoculation against the accusations. Court filings and biographical research documented a consistent pattern of controlling behavior and violence across his marriages. Author Richard Douglas Jensen, who spent decades researching Wayne for a biography, concluded that he committed domestic violence against all 3 of his wives and described a man who spent his life trying to embody the values he portrayed on screen and frequently failed. Jensen also described Wayne as a severe alcoholic whose rages were unpredictable and whose public image bore almost no resemblance to his private reality. The mythology of John Wayne was so thoroughly embedded in American culture, reinforced by presidents, eulogized by Ronald Reagan, inducted into the national consciousness, that the abuse allegations barely dented it. He died in 1979. His third wife, Pilar Palet's separation from him in 1973 was quiet and almost unnoticed. Number 4. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy won 2 consecutive Academy Awards for Best Actor, for Captain's Courageous in 1937 and Boys Town in 1938, the only male actor to achieve that at the time, and was so respected by his peers that Katharine Hepburn, his partner of 26 years, called him the finest actor she had ever seen work. Tracy was born in Milwaukee in 1900. He married actress Louise Treadwell in 1923, and they had 2 children. He never divorced her, even when his decades-long relationship with Katharine Hepburn began in 1942. Hepburn later said she respected the fact that he would not leave his wife, even as it limited the nature of what they could be to each other. What was less discussed publicly was Tracy's severe alcoholism and the violence it fueled. He went on drinking binges that lasted days or weeks at a time, during which he became a different person, erratic, dangerous, and physically threatening. His wife Louise endured years of this. Friends and colleagues who worked with him described the difference between the sober Tracy, who was warm, disciplined, and generous, and the drinking Tracy, who was frightening to be around. Director John Ford, who directed several of their most celebrated collaborations, had to manage Tracy's drinking on multiple productions and was himself known for treating cast members roughly. Tracy struggled throughout his life with guilt over his son John being born deaf, a burden he carried from the moment of the birth, and which his biographers have described as the emotional root of much of his drinking. He and Louise channeled some of that guilt into establishing the John Tracy Clinic at USC, dedicated to education for deaf children, which opened in 1942 and continues operating today. It stands as perhaps the most lasting good thing that came from one of Hollywood's most complicated marriages. He died in 1967, just 17 days after completing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner alongside Hepburn. He was 67. Hepburn, who was on set with him to the end, did not attend his funeral because Louise was there, and Hepburn did not wish to intrude. Louise Treadwell Tracy never spoke publicly about the violence. Number 3. James Caan. James Caan made his name playing Sonny Corleone in The Godfather, 1972. The volatile, hot-tempered eldest son of the crime family, quick to rage and quicker with his fists. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and made him one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema. Born in the Bronx in 1940, Caan built a career playing physically imposing, emotionally explosive characters in films like Brian's Song, 1971, Thief, 1981, and Misery, 1990, in which he played the antagonist to Kathy Bates's terrifying performance. He had a devoted following and was regarded within the industry as one of the genuinely talented actors of his generation. He was arrested in 1994 on a misdemeanor assault charge stemming from a domestic violence incident involving a former girlfriend. The charge was a single legal manifestation of a pattern of behavior that several partners and former wives described over the years. A man whose charm and sense of humor could disappear rapidly and unpredictably, replaced by a dangerous rage. He was married 5 times. He acknowledged in later interviews that his behavior had hurt people he cared about, and that he had not been the person he should have been in his personal life. What is notable about Caan's case, and about several on this list, is the degree to which a reputation for toughness on screen served as a kind of explanation or even an endorsement for behavior off it. Playing violent men was understood as a performance. The line between where the performance stopped and the man began was less clear. He died in July 2022 at the age of 82 from coronary artery disease. The tributes were extensive and warm, focused almost entirely on his body of work. Number 2, Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was the most influential stand-up comedian of the 20th century. His albums and concert films in the 1970s and early 1980s changed what comedy was allowed to say and how it was allowed to say it. The rawness, the honesty, the willingness to talk about race, poverty, addiction, and violence from the inside. Richard Pryor, Live in Concert, 1979, is still taught in film schools as a masterclass in performance. He was also, across multiple relationships and marriages, a man who used violence against the women he loved. Pryor was born in Peoria, Illinois, in 1940, and grew up in a brothel run by his grandmother after his mother abandoned him. The chaos and violence of his childhood became both the raw material of his comedy and a template he repeated in his own relationships. He was married 7 times to 6 different women. His drug use, cocaine particularly, and later freebase, amplified an already volatile temperament and periodically turned him dangerous. He was physically violent with multiple partners over the years. His companion Pam Grier, the actress who dated him in the mid-1970s, later described incidents of physical abuse during their relationship that she eventually left him over. Multiple other partners and ex-wives described a man who could be tender and hilarious, and then, without much warning, threatening, and violent, a pattern that his autobiography, Prior Convictions, published in 1995, addressed with unusual directness. In that book, Pryor wrote about his own capacity for cruelty and his inability to control it, framing it within the larger chaos of his drug addiction and his traumatic childhood. He didn't excuse himself, but he didn't fully explain it either. Some things don't explain. He set himself on fire in June 1980 while freebasing cocaine, an accident that left him with severe burns over much of his body and which he turned, 18 months later, into the raw centerpiece of Richard Pryor, Live on the Sunset Strip, 1982. He was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1986 and spent his final 2 decades in progressive physical decline. He died on December 10, 2005, at the age of 65. Number 1, Ernie Kovacs. For the first 9 entries on this list, the names are among the most recognizable in the history of American entertainment. The 10th belongs to a man less universally famous than the others, but whose story is perhaps the most disturbing in terms of what power and money allowed a man to do without consequence for years. Ernie Kovacs was one of television's earliest innovators, a comedian, writer, and performer who pioneered visual and absurdist comedy on the new medium in the 1950s and whose influence on later television comedians and shows was significant and direct. He was genuinely creative, genuinely funny, and genuinely important in the early history of TV as an art form. He was also married twice, and what he did to his first family is one of the uglier stories in the history of the entertainment industry. His first wife was Bet Lee Wilcox, with whom he had 2 daughters, Bet and Kippy. When they divorced in 1952, the court awarded Wilcox full custody of the girls. Kovacs did not accept this outcome. He took the children from their mother, moved with them to Florida, and then further to Cuba, keeping them hidden from her for approximately 3 years. Wilcox spent those years looking for her daughters, fighting through courts, hiring investigators, following leads, and watching as Kovacs used his resources and his connections to stay one step ahead. The children lived a transient, unstable existence during this period, moving repeatedly so their father could avoid being found. Bet was approximately 9 years old, and Kippy was around 7. Both girls had lived through the entire ordeal with full awareness of what was happening. Kovacs remarried actress Edie Adams and had a 3rd daughter with her. He died in a car accident in Los Angeles in January 1962 at the age of 42. His professional reputation remained largely untouched by what he had done to his first family. The kidnapping was known to those who knew him and has been documented by biographers in the decades since. But it never became the dominant fact of his public legacy the way it would for almost anyone whose story emerged today. The silence that covered it all. The golden age of Hollywood had a system for keeping these stories quiet. Studios employed fixers, men like Howard Strickling at MGM, whose entire job was to manage scandal and protect the investments the studios had made in their stars. Police departments in Los Angeles were, for decades, willing to look the other way when the person in question was famous enough. Newspapers and magazines could be pressured, paid, or simply relied upon to protect the stars their readers adored. Divorce settlements came with silence clauses. The women who were harmed had no movement behind them, no social media, no public forum in which their accounts would be believed, and often no financial independence that would allow them to leave. None of these men faced serious professional consequences for what they did at home. Most of them continued working, collecting awards, and being celebrated as national treasures. Several received presidential tributes. Their names are on theaters and awards and retrospectives. The women they hurt are remembered when they are remembered at all, as wives and companions, footnotes to the careers of the men who damaged them. What's also striking across all 10 of these stories is the pattern of protection that surrounded each man. Their violence wasn't secret to the people who knew them. Directors knew, studios knew, friends knew. In most cases, colleagues and co-workers accommodated the drinking, managed the rages, and said nothing publicly. The culture of that era treated domestic violence as a private matter, a family problem that had no business becoming anyone else's concern. The stories don't change what these actors made. Captain Blood and The Godfather and The Adventures of Robin Hood are still what they are. But knowing what went on behind them is part of the full picture. And these women's experiences deserve to be part of that picture too. If this video made you think, hit the like button and subscribe. There are more stories like these that deserve to be told.